Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Vancouver Real. I'm your solo host today, Mike Zaremba. Andy couldn't join me today. He's got parental duties, so I'm going to fly it solo on this beautiful Friday late afternoon. And as per usual, we're podcasting here at a float house at 70 West Cordova Street in downtown Vancouver, BC. And thanks for joining us wherever you may be. And if you haven't heard of flotation therapy before, perhaps you're being joined to this episode from our guest today. Flotation therapy is a unique practice that we look at where you go into an environment of maximal sensory reduction created by a float tank and basically go into a very calming state for your central nervous system created by this sensory reduction. And it's a great way to just relax, to de-stress, but also to kind of go within a little bit. It kind of redirects your awareness internally and get to check in to see what's going on the inside as opposed to what's always being drawn outside of you externally. So check out floathouse.ca if you're curious about that and use the promo code VancouverReal to save 20% on a single float if you're in the area. On top of that, we have the Vancouver Real community where we do monthly meetups. They're always free. So check out the webpage and under the community section, and you can see what the next Vancouver Real meetup is. And we cover a vast array of topics and skills, and whether it's fitness or nutrition or music workshops or whatever it is. We kind of just explore a whole plethora of things. And it's more about just getting people together doing something and connecting in real life versus digitally, whether it's through iTunes if you're listening or on YouTube. So definitely come and check out the community if you are in the area or dropping in. We'd love to see you and hang out. So I'm going to dive into today's episode. There's a little caveat to set this up. James W. Gesso, who has been on our show a couple times, was very adamant that I get our guest on today. He had him on his podcast, Adventures Through the Mind, ATT Mind Radio, I think it is. He's doing an excellent job with his show. And James was very supportive of me making this effort while our guest was in town touring. And I'm speaking of Stephen Jenkinson. And Stephen is an author, he's a farmer, he's a founder of a school called the Orphan Wisdom, and he lives out in the Ottawa Valley.
That's right.
And so he's made the long journey across the country here to sit with us in the studio. And he's also, I guess, one of the big draws of him coming out here was to do a book talk with an affiliation with Banyan Books for one of your books called Die Wise. And I think we'll probably start into that area, but I think there's a lot of other areas that I'm going to cover here or try to get into with you. So, but without further ado, Stephen, welcome to Vancouver Real.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Awesome. So, I guess, I mean, I had not read your book yet, but I've listened to watched a couple of the videos online, and I've done a little bit of reading, and it's kind of an interesting topic, to say the least, about dying.
Kind of an interesting topic,
right? You know, it'll make the top 10. Okay. Right.
Okay.
But I really appreciate the direction that I've skimmed into about where you're going with this and bringing dying into a mainstream awareness, a conversation in a different frame. I guess my first question is, what was your original motivation around creating a book of this nature? And then we'll get into what the book is about. Maybe those will tie in, I'm not sure, but they may.
We'll see. Well, I wrote the book subsequent to everything that's in it. It kind of sounds obvious, but it's worthwhile saying. I didn't grow into a book I'd already written. I didn't start doing a kind of work that I imagined in the book and then tried to live out. It was the reverse. I was pretty much reporting. And, at one level, the thing that occurred to me early on was I'd had this film, Grief Walker, that the NFB had made about me and what I'd done. And I observed early on that this thing grows legs, and it can go all manner of places that I'll never go to. And So I realized, well, a book certainly has something similar in its scope and its abilities, if it's any good, if it's got its own voice and so on. That was part of it. The other part was, it's an occupational hazard of being in the death trade that you have grown somewhat familiar with your own demise yourself. And you're very loath to take waking up in the morning for granted, as if it were just an inevitable given. That because you've eaten enough bran, right? You've thought enough good thoughts, you're going to live forever.
Aren't we all?
Like most people I buried.
Right.
They had that walking around for the longest time. And I should tell you, in case you would imagine that, working the death trade amounts to working in geriatrics, that a third of the people that I worked with at any given time were younger than me who were dying at any given time. So it has nothing to do with age per se, right?
Can I jump in real quick? Because I was trying to find that. What were you doing before? What is this death trade? What are you talking about? What's your occupation with that?
Was my occupation.
Was?
Yeah. Yeah, because I burned the bridge by looking at the way it was built. I burnt the bridge. Yeah, that's why I'm sitting talking to you on a Friday, not gainfully employed somewhere.
Right.
Well, I didn't know there was such a thing as the death trade. As naive as it sounds now, but going back 15 or 20 years, the death trade as a front page news event was a rare thing. People, as a rule, didn't talk about it. It wasn't in polite conversation, and it wasn't out there. I mean, that's all happened since those days. So I was essentially talked into it, you could say. It was very, very simply a woman who knew me tried to get me to join the hospital staff, and I educated her steeply on how deeply unachieved I was as a team player, and plays well with others in the sandbox, that kind of thing.
Right.
And not that all it meant was I knew what my disinclinations were, and I'm not an organizational guy, and that's what I tried to help her understand. And the hospital, for God's sake, you can't get more organizational than that.
Right.
And she said, she sort of split the difference, and she said, we got a bunch of men here at the hospital. They either had somebody die on them fairly recently, or somebody's dying now. And they're terrifying the hospital staff, and most of whom are women. So you have a lot of dynamics already.
Right.
I say, what's so terrifying about these guys? Though I had a pretty strong idea what it would be. She said, well, they're divided up into two groups. One's aggressive and hostile and belligerent and petulant and like that. Well, that's pretty intimidating. I said, sure, okay. What about the other guys? Oh, they're much worse, she said. And I drew a blank on what much worse could be. And she said, they don't say anything at all. And two kinds of intimidation, right? And the second one was for all the women in question, much worse. Could you just take them off our hands? Was the invitation. And do what? We don't care, she said. So I don't mean to make them sound overly dismissive, but they saw no upside to engaging these men. They were adjunct relations to the patients. Whereas I knew, even then intuitively, having sat with them twice, 2-3 hour sessions, I knew pretty intuitively and pretty immediately that how this dying went was determined in part by these guys, and subsequently determined their lives. Which is to say, if the dying didn't go well, and it rarely did, the consequences of that bad death did not end when that person stopped breathing. In fact, you could say that's when they began to gain momentum and substance and real traction and devastation as they went. So it's a bit like a stone in a still pond, that the reverberations increase over time.
Right.
And time does not heal in that sense at all. So then I realized early on I was probably in a kind of inadvertent business that was principally cultural, not psychological, certainly not medical, mostly cultural.
Okay.
And I understood myself after a while to be a culture worker, you could say, who had a secondment to the death trade. Nobody used the phrase the death trade when I came in. To my knowledge, nobody uses it still.
I was going to say, I've never heard of it.
No, it's my, such as it is, it's my formulation, which is an absolutely authentic formulation for what the endeavor is. That it is indeed, even in this country, not driven overly by the profit motive. It is certainly a trade, and properly so, and properly understood that way. And the other thing is that this is the only thing that everyone you work with has in common, is that they're dying. Whether they know they're dying, whether they think of themselves that way, or anything of the kind, secondary. But they're dying all right, and that's why you're with them. No matter what you say, no matter what your business card says, that's why you're in their lives, such as it is for the brief duration. So by the third week, it became very clear to me that these guys were as angry as they were, largely because they weren't very good at another mandatory part of the emotional repertoire, sadness. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not disqualifying anger at a time like that. Far from it. That stuff is as mandatory and as fruitful as anything could be. The fact that it unnerves some people doesn't mean it shouldn't be there.
Right.
See what I mean? I mean, people who are unnerved by other people's anger might want to
It's
learn a little
highly
bit
taboo.
about anger.
It's very taboo.
Yeah, and worse.
Right.
It's with shamed.
Sure.
And so forth like this. But for all of that, you know, we're talking about repertoire here. And as I said, anger was a bit of a cover story for a deep inability where sadness was concerned, including the inability to imagine that there could be any upside, any depth to sadness, that it wasn't the end of depth, but it was a depth unto itself, a depth of feeling and kind of deep participation in the world and so on. Well, this was utter news to these guys, and frankly, in those days, it was kind of news to me that I had to begin to make the case for it. Well, by the third week, they gave our meeting a name. They called it Sad School. And instead of lasting 6 weeks, which is all I committed to, that thing lasted 18 months at their insistence. And we, like a tumbleweed, we kind of gathered up people as we went. And within 18 months, I guess I had come to the attention of the hospital in some fashion or other. I mean, benign attention, you could say. And the case was made for that they would make room for the particulars of my way of coming at this, because I was an insider, right? And they knew it. And I don't know, the brain trust for the time being seemed to have figured that I was approaching something like a good idea.
Okay.
And that's how it began. And I was taken into the counseling program at the hospital. But we were working in the community. Our job was to help people die at home if that was in any way doable. So that freed me from the normal office hallway politics of things, which was wise for all concerned. And I became the beneficiary of benign administrative neglect. And it was immaculate arrangement for me. Basically, the powers that be figured, unless they heard otherwise, everything was working. So nobody ever inquired. Nobody really superintended. It's not that I wasn't answerable.
Right.
I was, and properly so. But somehow they intuited that I was like one of these self-directed people whose self-direction was not predicated on my own style or my own desire to be satisfied with what I was doing, that I had some other devotion than my own satisfaction. And I don't think they were wrong about that. And for a while, it worked out just supremely well for everybody concerned. At a certain point, I got kicked upstairs so many times that I was, I'll put it subtly, I was in a position of clinical responsibility whereby I had something to say about the clinical practice of physicians. And that's where it was going to go off the rails, and that's where it did go off the rails. Because understandably so, no physician is going to take any kind of marching orders from somebody who's not a physician.
Right.
You know.
Interesting.
But in those those years and 1,000 or whatever, I mean, I didn't count literally the number of dying people I was with, but it was in the hundreds and hundreds. And somewhere in there refloated the idea that the principal realities of dying are cultural realities. And that if you're going to have anything to say or to do about how badly people were dying on your watch, you could not do it by recourse to psychological means, re-psychologizing, or you really had to go at the level of culture. And if you didn't, you were pretty much part of the problem. And that became the flag I was flying.
And so I'm just curious, not to get into too many like this weird little details, but so that was an 18-month program you're doing, or did it extend beyond that?
Yeah.
For years?
I didn't do that sort of men's group work for very long.
Okay.
Very quickly, I became a supervisor as well as doing the clinical work.
Okay, is that what you meant by kicked upstairs?
Yeah, kicked upstairs.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then, I mean, I always kept my hand in the work, but then I ended up hiring people.
Okay.
Eventually, we got funded to do a very experimental program working with kids who are dying. And I designed that and implemented that and hired for that and so on. So there's some meetings that are associated with a budget of that size.
Totally.
But my love was always in sitting in a stilled room with immensely distraught people or their families and seeing if it could ever be otherwise.
Interesting.
And I did that consistently all the way through.
And so, what was it that your connection at the hospital originally contacted you? Where did you come from? What were you doing? Like, why did they ask you to do this? Like, what was your background before that?
You should have her here to answer that, but I'm not sure I see the obvious connectedness.
She was just a friend?
Well, she was working in the hospital herself, so she certainly knew the inner sanctum of the whole thing. And, I had a master's degree from Harvard Divinity School. I tried to get into priesthood. I went into the divinity school utterly persuaded about my inevitable appearance in the priesthood, in the white-collar program, as I called it. And it didn't occur to me, this is going to sound painfully naive to you, but it didn't occur to me that attendance at some kind of church or other might have been a prerequisite for being a preacher of some description.
Okay.
But the truth was, I had never been to church in my life. And this came out early on, as you might imagine, because there's a fairly hilarious story. We don't have the time for it, but the short version is, as somebody from Canada, I'm sitting across the table from a Southern Baptist preacher.
Okay.
Those are the guys who are sweating on TV. Those guys.
Right, okay.
Okay, that's who's sitting there. And very briefly, it goes like this. He said, first question, what's the name of your sponsoring congregation? I know what all those words mean, and I know I don't have one. So I said to him, being quick on my feet, I said, I just haven't worked that out yet. He said, that's all right. He said, just give me the name of your denominational affiliation then. That's what he said. I know what that means too. I'm 2 out of 2, and I think I'm already busted.
Wow.
I can't believe it. I have this whole scheme in mind for what my life could possibly be. I'm 2 questions in. On the first morning in the place. And I've got nothing to show for both questions. I said, well, I haven't figured that out yet either. So he took one look at me for a second. He said, son, where do you go to church? Like that. And I said, and I realized I have nothing to hide anymore. Right. I said, I don't go to church. Where did you go to church then? Because he's still grasping at straws.
Sure.
And I said, I didn't go to church. He said, let me see if I understand the situation. You proposed to go into ministry of something or other. You had never been to church. I said, that's correct. And he said, well, I never. Just let it. And I said, I never neither. And they counseled me out of that program. So there I was, a week into being at Harvard, right, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as a foreign student. And I'm totally rerouted, right? And so the amazing thing is, if you're unkind to me, you could say, well, you just found a way to preach by the means. Or if you're kind to me, you'd say virtually the same thing. Mysteriously, whatever it was that was alive inside me and had claimed me at an early age didn't just take no for an answer. It's simply like a river around a stone. It didn't seek out, you could say, the obvious legitimacy of a pulpit or the equivalent inside the ecclesia. Don't forget, I wasn't any more a team player then than I was, 15 or how many, 20, 25 years later at the hospital. But between the two, it was mysteriously undefeated inside me. But I can't take any credit for it because it's not like I could never have told you this at the time. I didn't know all this was up and around, you see. But these things have a way of having a more authoritative voice where you are concerned than you could ever manage for yourself. And then the circumstances recoalesce years later. You, perhaps a little wiser than you were at the time, a little less naive at least, And then there's something about you and whatever learning you've done since that becomes employable. I don't mean literally, the job, but I mean at this other level we're talking about now. And I got gathered in, you could say. And I claimed I had no particular skill that it would seem this job would require. And she was of a different opinion. And I listened to her. And within 18 months, I never thought about it again. And I looked up one day, and I realized I had not had one moment on the job where I was unsure of myself. Not a moment. Not staring at the window, sweating, wondering what I was doing, feeling the imposter, or anything of the kind. Maybe that could sound like arrogance to some people. All I can tell you is it's an antidote to arrogance. To sit there and know you're in the saddle of the life that you were born to. There's no argument about it. There's no contentiousness. And you're not bragging. I mean, you're two things. You're enormously lucky. And now you have to stand and deliver. And both those things are true at the same time. If you're lucky enough to come around to the notion that you are where you were born to be. And that's what occurred to me. So however I proceeded from that moment on was rooted in that quiet assurance.
Did it occur to you during that period, like in the moment you kind of realized I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing?
I never would have said it that way.
Okay.
But I did know that I was never troubled by lack of experience. I'm a circumspect sort of person, I can think these things. I could have sat there and thought to myself, this is nuts. I've never been anywhere close to this kind of endeavor, and here I am in charge. On the paper, it doesn't make any sense, or worse. But in this particular case, I never had the thought. In a fundamental way that was an enabling for me, I knew what to do. I don't say I knew everything. Of course not. And I learned a lot, but I was administratively naive, but clinically adept. And both of those caught up to me. The clinical adeptness deepened over time, and I'm very lucky and I'm very proud of that. But my administrative naivete never really was doctored. It never really was eclipsed by any savvy in this regard. So I never watched myself, and I was overly candid, in meetings and so on like this. And I look back on it now, I laugh, and I feel sorry for that person who was so naive, believing that everyone was there essentially to figure out how to do the absolute best by the dying people. And I don't say that it wasn't there, but I would just say there was a lot of other things that were there too. And most of those things prompted me to write Die Wise.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're doing these groups. You have mostly men.
All men.
All men.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I'm actually a part of a men's group, and we meet weekly. And it's just, I don't know if I had to genre it. It's kind of, I would say, part of like the mytho-poetic men's movement that's kind of happening in different areas where men are exploring masculinity, exploring femininity, both within themselves and within culture and within relationship to everything in their lives, I guess. Yeah. And having just open, we do different exercises and then do different sharing and then just kind of, support each other in different ways. And I guess less, I'd say contemporary cultural ways of, say, like two guys going to a bar and having a drink or watching the game or, that kind of stereotype, right?
Yeah.
And we're just sitting in a room in a circle facing each other, saying whatever you want to say, and kind of getting your mind exposed, your thoughts, your sharing as much as you can, and that's a process for everybody too, how much they can share. And it's like I've been almost a year now, and it's been really interesting and very, very pragmatic, I think, in different areas of my life. So I can imagine this sort of work where you're got this niche of men going through probably ultimately one of the most intense moments of their lives.
Yeah.
And it was group work, or was it more one-on-one, or?
No. It was always in the context of 7 or 8 or 10 or
right, okay,
12 or 14. I don't think it got much bigger than that.
I don't think you can go much bigger than that for that kind of work.
These guys, when I called them up initially,
Yeah.
they a lot of them declined.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as they found out there was going to be no women in the room. Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah.
Why do you think, or
at that
looking back-
moment, I didn't know why.
Okay.
But by the fourth guy, I was quick enough to say, when this guy declined as well, I said, no, this is going to work out great for you, man.
Yeah.
And he said, no, I just said I don't want to do it. I said, I know, but this is turning into a group for men who don't want to be in a group for men. This is
Right.
what you all have in common. It'd be just, anyway,
Yeah.
that wasn't a selling feature either. I think it came down to this. There is something about approaching a kind of open woundedness that someone dying on you certainly inflicts on your life. That without, and I'm going to put this in quotation marks, without the moderating presence, moderating emotional presence of women, that a lot of guys can be deeply unnerved about what could conceivably happen. Okay? That high emotion
Okay.
doesn't go necessarily towards openness, let's say. It can go, it can coalesce in a lot of other places.
Right.
And if you have a room full of guys from the dominant culture of North America who are card-carrying members of that culture, it's no surprise to anybody listening that there's a constriction of the emotional repertoire, let's just say. It's not specific to men. Women have a similar constriction that's differently located, let's put it this way. But in men's case, the capacity for being enabled by anger is a very familiar one. And I'm going to say it again, a necessary one many times indeed. But they certainly came to the idea of sadness or sorrow or grief and so on as the very undoing of ability, of being enabled, of being up on your feet and ready to roll kind of thing. It was, to use the language of the professional culture, depotentiating.
Okay.
Right? Taking away from you rather than entrusting you with the skillfulness you never imagined was skillful. That was the dynamic, I think, and that's what was unnerving about women not being there. It was as if, legions of men continue relying upon women to fill out the emotional
Spectrum.
picture.
Sure.
Spectrum, very good, yeah.
Yeah.
And failing to do so, failing to have women there, that spectrum is left like a ghost town in some fashion that nobody wants to inhabit. Now, this is a great generalization.
Sure.
And I should say there's all kinds of men who are capable in this area and all kinds of women who aren't. So, that hopefully that goes without saying.
Right.
But I'm telling you, in the little experience that I had, it occurred to me that this was part of the aversion.
Yeah, well, when you get a pattern of 4 guys out of your initial 4 calls of rejecting it, it's like, okay, there's something here then. This is
Surely.
not random.
No.
Okay.
No, indeed, yeah.
And I think that's really interesting. And we also live in a very interesting time where even you just saying that, you could get people saying, there's a lot of stuff going out about male privilege and trouncing masculinity in different ways and how it's toxic and this kind of stuff,
Yeah, that's going to work out just fine.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
I
So what about it? You're mentioning it to me so that what?
Well, I guess I'm just playing devil's advocate for people that don't want to hear that's not true, that men and women aren't different, in that we, they get this, although of course we are, but this notion of like, why do men need to go and separate themselves on their own? I think you articulated that, just why, in my opinion. But there's definitely a movement out there in different ways. I feel that men are like the enemy. The male patriarch has dominated and suppressed and all this kind of stuff. And maybe I'm tying in completely different things, and I think I am, but people, I think, have challenges to discriminate and separate those types of notions. And I'm just curious, this is a little off topic, but as to just your thoughts on men doing this sort of work and being comfortable in a form of masculinity that is serving for them and for the community and for the culture, and like just your I personally believe that this type of work is extremely important now more than ever, almost in our culture. And I'm just wondering if you have any comments on that.
Well, the belligerence on the matter just doesn't concern me. I think I've heard every conceivable slander and slight, directed towards, quote, men, unquote. Men participating at least as vehemently in the slander as women do, certainly. So nobody's got the market corner on either side. And the fact that there's a willingness to reduce the human endeavor to what side of the gender line you might fall, and that's the whole story, or that's so significant that it eclipses all the other ones, or whatever it is.
Right.
It's just more of the same. It's just it's an unwillingness to be thrown off the scent of being on the right side of history by the remarkable complexity, which is trying to cobble together a humanity to live by. A humanity to live by that doesn't eclipse or leave behind questions of gender. But honest to God, the stuff I hear today, I'm simply not claimed by it at all. If I understand myself to be a culture worker, then, questions of gender are a minor keyed aspect. And I would go further and say, it's no surprise to me that the self-appointed watchdogs in the dominant culture of North America have fixated upon this gender business, because this is exactly a furtherance of what drew them to it in the first place. That there is a kind of fundamental intellectual dishonesty that refuses to acknowledge that these things are not as determining as their various accomplices and spokespeople claim them to be. If you're drawn into yes or no or pro or con, you're toast. You might as well not say a word. So rather than that, I simply say, you fight that fight out as you see fit. You won't find me there. And it's not I abandoned the field. If you care to look and care to read, I was there probably around the time you were born. It doesn't make me any kind of an expert. I'm just saying there's very little that's new in the self-hatred game. Very little. And self-hatred or misanthropy today is the current incarnation of self-absorption. I think that's a fundamental manifestation of that. That's all. So you won't find me there. You're going to have to go to a different bar, we'll have a different drink. That's all.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing on that.
You bet.
I'm going to shift back into dying.
Okay. Easier.
Yeah, definitely, right?
In some respects.
Yeah, I'm sure some people...
Until you get there.
Right.
Yeah, and then you wish you had gender politics on your mind.
Right. Yeah, but anything to distract you, right?
Yes.
But let's talk about Die Wise and what this book is about, and ultimately, what it means. Obviously, we can't go into the detailed depths of a book here, but I think I want to try to introduce people to what you're trying to get at with this book and why you wrote it, and what is Dying Wise? What does that mean?
Okay. Well, the first thing is I'm not trying to get at anything. I'm accomplished enough that I got to it. So it's not a matter of trying. It's there. It's like people say, what are you trying to say? No. I'm saying it.
Gotcha.
I'm not trying to say it. So, part of it is in the title. I chose the title very deliberately. When you see it on a piece of paper, it looks German.
Yeah, it does.
Oh, it does. Completely does. And, as a piece of grammatical observation, I'm introduced not infrequently as the author of the book Die Wisely. They put that L-Y at the end, which is not there. And, at 2 words, it's not easy to screw it up as a title.
Right.
But it does happen with some frequency. And I started to pay attention to what that meant. And then I did the grammar and I said, that's what it is. So it comes to this.
Okay.
If I had called the book Die Wisely, I'm colluding with the idea that there is a thing called how you die, which is distinguishable from, you guessed it, how you lived. Like it's a standalone something. I call that collusion because I can tell you, in my years in the death trade, there's no doubt that people die in the manner of their living. Not suddenly departing from the manner of their living. Not obtaining that deathbed grace or certainty or vision that had eluded them mysteriously through their time of being able-bodied and healthy. Virtually never saw it happen. People died in the manner in which they lived, right? So if they lived small, they died small. If they lived ungrateful and ungracious, those aspects were in their dying, and so on down the line. So there's no such thing, basically, as an 11th hour epiphany. You know, for the handful of exceptions, there's a reason they're called exceptions. The rule is what we should be concerned with, it seems to me, not the exception. So I called it die wise, in that way of crafting and understanding. I was saying that the word wise doesn't refer to your manner of dying. It refers to you, by which I'm saying the entire book pleads for the pursuit of wisdom, right? Wisdom. This is a very antique word to use anymore, you know, where all the language is psychodynamic and it's all at the level of emotional lucidity and things of this kind. And wisdom, the word itself embarrasses intellectual people, you know, and so-called thinkers and so on, as if there's no such thing, quote, anymore, if there ever was. And certainly the idea of received wisdom that comes through the charcoal filters of culture. This has all been discredited, you know. The constructionism and all the rest has done its dastardly work. And, you know, you don't trust anybody. If you had any reason to trust somebody older than you before the advent of that intellectual pursuit, you certainly don't afterwards. The idea, for example, that there's anything inheritable from generations past that serves well. This is a deeply discredited notion today, right? Okay. So in the book, one of the cases I was pleading for is the idea that dying well or wise is a political act. It is an act of love. It is a subversive Trojan horse kind of endeavor. And it's a radical spiritual project. Just choose 4 off the top of my head. And then to make the case that dying could in any way be political was not an easy case to make until you begin to look at things as they stand now. And when you see how the dominant culture of North America understands dying to be nothing more than another aspect of your personal style, another way in which you express yourself, as if your dying is your own, to do with as you see fit, as if your dying resembles you the way a snowflake does, unique and particular and never before seen in the world. And you can hear the irony in my voice. So I'm suggesting deeply, this is one of the ways by which we die so lonely and so medicated, because we're, you know, bought and sold on a bill of goods that says your dying is yours. Well, your dying is no more yours than your body is yours, or this world is yours. This thing is entrusted to you. So what does that turn you into now? A proprietor? An owner? A vice regent? A sovereign? Or a servant? Could you imagine then, if any of those things are possible, that your own dying is entrusted to you as well? To care for. Not to endure. Not to subvert. To care for. In exactly the same way that if you have a child born to you, that's the language that's proper for that. It's not your child. You could say it in shorthand. But from the point of view of, look what you did, you didn't do that. That baby came through you. That's all. Not from you. Through you. And to you. And can you carry yourself for 15 or 20 years, remembering that more often than not. So it's no surprise that people come to their dying time understanding that if they don't feel like dying right now, if it's not their inclination, if they're not ready, then they have no obligation to be dying when they are. And we have the medical technology so sophisticated in this town as much as anywhere else on the continent, whereby You can simply subvert the idea that it's your time to die. You can literally subvert it. I'm not making this up. And it's not future tense. This is already true. It's been true for quite a while now. You know, everyone I worked with in the death trade, all the patients, they were all in the more time that they were still wondering if they were going to get. How did they get there? By any nominal palliative surgery or chemotherapy or radiation, they had already had their life extended. And yet, they were wondering if they were going to have their life extended. And that's what they were doing with the more time they'd already been granted. See? So the more time became two things that nobody counted on. One, it became an opportunity for you to utterly exhaust your wretched repertoire for doing things the way you wanted to. And the other thing it visited upon you was more dying. If they extend your life when you're dying anyhow, which is the norm today, what you get with that package is more dying. There's no question about it.
Right.
You get more symptoms, more drugs for the symptoms, more drugs for the side effects of those drugs, and so on and so forth, and more alertness to the fact that you're dying anyhow, no matter what they did, how much they shrunk the tumor, etc. Right? So what is it in the dominant culture of North America that readies anyone to have more death to go along with their more life? What? What cultural training is there that gives you a sense that, this is a time you never imagined would be available to you. What shall you do with it? So let's take an example. So the Americans, God bless them, are generating, cultural artifacts by the fistfuls as we sit here.
Right.
So there was a film. This film, the title of the film, has enjoyed such a degree of cultural penetration now. It's absolutely breathtaking that people employ the title of the film to characterize a moral obligation that they suddenly now have, having heard the phrase. And of course, the name of the film is Bucket List. You've heard the phrase. It's unbelievable.
Right.
It went from nothing to everybody's got a bucket list in 5 years.
Right.
Okay. If you actually watch the film from the point of view of wondering, what's the attitude or the view or the stance towards dying in this film? It's dismissive, it's combative, and it's adversarial. That's the emotional tone, that's the philosophical stance, that's the existentialism of the film. Okay? So how does dying come out in a movie allegedly about dying? Comes out as the booby prize, that you're a sucker if you fall for it, and you should be scaling the mountain and riding Harley off into the distance and all of that thing. And so the best way I've ever found to give us a feel for this bill of goods is to say, this is a movie that should have been called something that rhymes with bucket list. Because that's the actual attitude towards dying. And those are the only movies that you watch. You won't watch a movie in which dying is an absolutely legitimate consequence of having been born. That it was as least as worthy of your life as all of your successes were. Just to take a couple of strange ideas. That your dying is entrusted to you to care for. So maybe the language is not after a long and courageous battle, as all the obituaries say. Because what's the rest of that? If your dying was a long and courageous battle, how does it end? You lose. That's what it means.
Right.
If you understand it in those military terms, men again. Hey, come on now. It's not just men who come to it this way, not by any stretch. How many times was I there when a dying loved one was implored by their family members not to give up? This language is all radioactive. No. Give up what? Give up the will to live. But hold on a second. I'm dying. How much will to live am I supposed to have when I'm finally a legitimate human? In other words, I could tell you one of the Rubicons of that work. It occurred to me after I'd seen it, 300 or 400 times probably, was we traffic in an understanding of love at a time like that, which is Teflon, which is titanium. And it goes like this. real love doesn't change. Real love embraces every challenge to it and prevails. Real love doesn't bend, doesn't break, doesn't doubt itself, doesn't shuffle its feet, doesn't go to plan B. No, no, no. Real love between people or for life, whatever it is, when you're dying, what does that look like? You refuse to die for as long as you can. That's real love. And you're surrounded by lunatic cheerleaders who oblige you not to quit. So that what? What's the outcome? A few more hours, a few more days. Of what, though? To be realistic, it's a few more days of the terror and the dread and the sweats, and to go along with maybe patting the dog a few more times and looking at somebody and saying, yeah, I love you already. I told you like 19 times or whatever it is. So here's my strange alternative. If love is love and not an insurance policy, and the person you love is dying, is your love supposed to reflect the fact that they're dying, or is it supposed to resist it? And I propose to you it's the first. That their dying has to appear in your way of loving them, to the point where you are able to love a dying person. And in that sense, realistically, your love is dying too. Now, I'm not saying it's not understandable that people are desperate to defend themselves and each other against that kind of passing away. And there's no question that it's understandable. But I'm talking about love here. I'm not talking about taking care of yourself. And if you really love somebody who's dying, your love should be one of the places where the dying person can go to find out where in the arc of their life they actually are. They go to your love to find out if they're dying or not. And they've got to be able to see it there. And if they don't see it there, you are not loving them anymore. You might be doing a lot of other things, but there's nothing in your love that's life-affirming now. Can I give you an example?
Please.
Quick little example. True story. Patient's 28 years old. She's not going to see 29. I got the referral form in front of me. She's got breast cancer, stage 3, metastases to the lungs. She's going to die of not being able to breathe. Okay, it's coming. She's probably on nasal prongs about 22 hours a day. When they let me into the house, indeed, that's exactly, she has edema, so she's swollen. She can't even, she'll never walk down the stairs again on her own. I wonder if she knows this much about her life, what I know about her life. I wonder if she knows it. I mean, imagine meeting somebody for the first time and that's current for you. Her mother's sitting beside, flown in from Winnipeg, helping out in a troubled time. I ask her, what's your understanding? What's happening? She says to me, I understand that I'm seriously ill, as if that's a synonym for dying, which it is not. But really, she said, I don't let it be a big part of my life. I told you the visuals, okay? This is not negotiable, whether it's a big part of your life. It is your life. But she looked, you think it can't get weirder. Oh, yes, it can, because her mom's sitting beside her. She looks over at her mom when she says this, and her mom gives her and me the big thumbs up, okay? And nods, and with obvious pride says to me, that's my girl. And that's what it looks like in real life. Everything I told you in the last 5 minutes, there it is in that story. Anybody watching that, not alerted to these things, would see what? Loving mother, very supportive. They're on the same page. Life can't get better than this unless she just gets a full recovery. But short of that, at least emotionally speaking, and maybe spiritually speaking, is this not health right in front of you? Is it? What if she were pregnant? And she says, she's at, the 8th month. And she says, I don't let it be a big part of my life. What would we call that then? Would we call it life-affirming? Or would you not call it something desperately approaching fundamental, almost criminal irresponsibility? That you're smoking as you see fit, drinking as you see fit, because the pregnancy is irrelevant to how you understand yourself. And that being really sane and really healthy is you being you, whether you're pregnant or not. But I tell you this, that very same orientation was brought to dying people, by dying people to their dying, routinely. And this was mistaken for being life-affirming and loving. And I found it my heartbreaking duty to see if I could work enough. And I didn't have a lot of time with these people, as you can imagine.
Sure.
And the clock is ticking.
Right.
And then the give a shit is ebbing. And the breath and so on. Everything. You don't have much to work with. Can you get these people to doubt themselves enough to hear otherwise? And to imagine that a dying 28-year-old daughter needs from her mom a kind of love where the dying doesn't disappear, where it's not denied, where it's given its proper and rightful due, whereby their ability to love each other is tuned and toned by the dying, not by the not dying. It's a tough sell.
Yeah. So
That's what I did every day.
why do you feel it's important? And maybe you might repeat some things you said, but I'm just going to go with this question. Why did you feel it's important that you communicate that to them? Let's say, and are you talking about not the person that's dying, but their loved one that you're working with,
Back
or
and
both?
forth, actually, back and forth.
Like,
Yeah.
why do you feel it's important? Let's talk about the person that is dying.
Okay.
Why do you feel it's important that they have a different relationship with death?
Not a different relationship for the sake of it being different. I'm very specific about the difference I'm advocating.
Okay.
It's not difference for difference's sake, you see. Not just have an alternative. So you don't have to buy Coke, you can buy Pepsi. Not that kind of illusory choice.
Okay.
I'm talking about this. I used the language of love a minute ago. And people in this business do not take up the language of love readily. Why? Well, it's too imprecise. Or it's not psychodynamically clear enough. Like it's muddy,
Right.
loving. I'm not sure. I don't agree with the characterization. Let me say that if people are making me out to be some kind of hypothetical monster here because I seem to be dictating how people ought to love each other, I would say it's understandable, but you obviously weren't there with me day in and day out and day in to see what it did for dying people to remain, quote, hopeful, unquote, when they were dying anyway. I can tell you this, that an unwillingness to reconsider what love meant at a time like that, unwillingness to understand what being life-affirming means when life is ending, not when you get another 6 years miraculously. What does life-affirming look like now? Without the willingness to wonder about those things, be not surprised that dying people towards their end of their life, with all of the New Age affirmations, with all of the medical technology available, with all the death literacy that this program might be helping to fashion today, they are more sedated, more antidepressed in terms of medication than they ever were during the time of their dying. Why? Why, with all the expertise, are so many people sedated at the end of their life? Well, I'm not asking you to guess. I'm telling you why. The fundamental reason was because people entirely misapprehended what dying was asking of them by keeping understanding that it was doing something to them instead of asking something from them. You see? So the fundamental orientation dictates the repertoire that you're going to employ. So you use the language of fighting, war on cancer and all the rest. Be not surprised that when you're dying, you're a loser. And what do we do with losers? We sedate them so their loss doesn't have to be so obvious. And then when they die, what do we say to their next of kin? We're sorry for your loss. The very word. You know, you think it's just words. Well, I tell you what, people died verbally. People cared for dying people in terms of the language they employ. No matter what your expertise is, medically speaking, all of the death trade workers engaged in the tongue as the principal way by which they delivered the care. And let this chill your bones, what I'm going to tell you now. There's very little training in how to employ the skills of the tongue for people who work in the death trade. When I was there, you know what the principal training was? What not to say.
Wow.
And it took the following form. If the patient was not ready to have the death talk you don't have it. You find 1,000 ways to indulge the unreadiness of the dying person, then you call that compassion. Professional compassion, personal, spiritual compassion, and the rest all took the form of genuflect to the unreadiness or the unwillingness of the dying person to be dying. I ask you to find the compassion in that. You won't be able to find it. Oh, you might got a lot of buy-in from the dying person. They might thank you for not, quote, pushing them on the death thing. But where do you end up by not doing so? You end up in sedation land, because here it is, and ready or not, it's a ready or not matter, you know. So if ready means you've taken out insurance policy, nothing's going to get weird, there's no such thing as readiness. But if readiness is something like being ready to be a parent, which is you don't get to get it ahead of time. When your first baby's coming down, you're not a parent yet. And then in 19 minutes from now, you are. Go.
I can speak to that. I had a child 3 weeks ago. It's my first child.
Okay. So I must have felt that. That's
you're hitting home on some things.
That's
here.
why I'm saying it.
Yeah.
You know, you can read all the books you want.
Right.
You can have all the talks.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. You can have all the deep talks.
Right.
Depth. All that depth is coming from never having been there. Okay. There is some merit to experience. Some. I've got a lot of it, but it doesn't. That's not what makes me any kind of guy that deserves to be on this show talking to you. But maybe the way I earned my stripes enough to be worthwhile listening to doesn't come from how many deaths I saw. It fundamentally comes from how distressed I was and then ended up being willing to be about what I saw. Okay? And I made it my responsibility to bear witness to what I saw. Does that make me a crusader? Yeah, I guess it does. Does it make me inalienably and finally right about everything I say? Almost, but not really. Not really. But I have no reason to lie, you see. I have no reason to misrepresent to you anything that I'm saying to you. I mean, nobody's paying me. I'm not on the, the quiet payroll of anybody, anywhere. So what? Oh, well, you're sort of psychologically needy. Well, no more than anybody else. So then what? How to discredit these things? Maybe you could consider them instead and just wonder, what's my personal motivation? I just told you. I was let in on a lot of people's during their dying time, the worst time of their lives. Okay, the inconceivably most distressing time of their lives. That's a privilege. And I don't know if you do anything to deserve the privilege a priori, in front of. But subsequent, after the fact, you might have to earn the privilege that you were extended. That's what you hear me sitting here doing now. Trying to earn the privilege that was extended to me. But I would say it was a burdensome privilege. It wasn't all truth and light. There was very little of that. Mostly it was ordinary, and it was heartbreaking, but deeply unspectacular, and not that redemptive for the most part. So what you see in the death trade is the death phobia. You don't see the heroes. The reason that people traffic in hero stories is because there's so few of them. That's all you'll hear. But so-and-so was diagnosed such and such, and they get 6 months to live, and it's 3 years later, and they're still alive. So if they can do it, you can do it. That's all you heard. You never heard so-and-so was diagnosed just like you, and they died on friggin' schedule, just the way you probably will.
Right.
Try to get away with telling that story. I mean, you could elaborate ever so slightly and sound a little more compassionate, but it would come down to this.
Yep.
You go and die, how do we know? Because we know what the stage is, that's why. Yeah, but it's me. Yeah, but that doesn't change anything, man. Yes, it's you. You just had a child. Do you know how many people have done it before you? Okay, may I say there's nothing special about it, okay? It is deeply ordinary. And I'll just go one step further and say, that's where the gods live. They don't live on the friggin' mountaintops, okay? They live in the ordinary. And the ordinariness of dying is right up there with the ordinariness of childbirth. So many's a time, just happened a few weeks ago. I was attending at some distance a birth on my farm. And the midwives came in, and I walked her from her car to where the mom was contracting. And in the space of 30 seconds, we recognized each other instantly. She said to me, "You're a midwife too." I said, "Yeah, of course, midwife too." And one of our jobs is not to get some duct tape and take the knees of life and bind them back together because nobody's ready for this birth. But in the death trade, people did that all the time. And they called that life affirming, or loving, or so. Anyway, I'm hogging the airway.
No.
What else you got?
No, this is good. I mean, a lot of things where I was thinking about when you were talking there. One thing I'll maybe go into is like when I have thought about death and my mortality, I've heard a couple inspiring stories of like, yeah, that sounds ideal. And in terms of like a scenario where you're surrounded by your family, so you're dying and you're at complete calm with it, and you get to be there with those and look around at them one more time and then simply close your eyes and let your life force go.
Right.
And it's kind of like you do it.
Yeah, doesn't it sound like that? Sound like another exercise of self-determination, doesn't it? Okay, so let me introduce a very likely yeah but in your scenario.
Sure.
Let's say you're all good with this, okay, which is,
Right.
I can promise you is a fleeting event. It's not like once you get good, now you're just good with it.
Right.
And nothing else ever happens again. Oh no, that shit comes and goes. But how about this? You're surrounded by your family. All of them sane? All of them down with this? Come on now. If that's what you really want, you're going to have to tighten up the circle around you. Can't have all comers.
Right.
Because everything's going to be in there.
Right.
Including you didn't try hard enough. And what about that experimental drug 6 weeks ago that they offered you? And. You see, and you're the one that cut this thing short. I mean, it can go sideways, more ways you can even imagine. Okay? So you start to play out the scenario. Ultimately, what happens is it sounds like you're doing the thing. You're kind of dialing it in. And you let your life force go. Okay, let's wonder about that idea for a second. I know the language is not that sophisticated, but that's not the dilemma. The dilemma is on what syllable you're putting the emphasis. Okay? So look, you're letting your life force go. So there's a you, and then there's this life force thing. And somehow you're like surrendering it to the great life force in the sky, or whatever the language is for it. How can there still be a you who's doing this surrendering thing? Given how immense the life force is, how can there still be a you who's giving it up, or surrendering it, or letting it run through his fingers? How could there be? In fact, aren't you quite a bit smaller than, quote, the life force? In just this way, that life is not your lifespan, right? And it's a thing to be, now that you're a father, you're fairly glad of that, though you may not have thought the thought until now. But now there's a thing called the future, right? Which is actually present. And you, although you've never thought the thought 3 weeks in, I'm fairly sure, but you can look down into the bassinet and you can say, with any grace or mercy in this world at all, this one lasts longer than I do. And immediately you get weepy, just the thought of it. Because, among other things, what have you engineered? Well, this one in the bassinet right now, with some good fortune and a few other things, that one's going to put you in the ground.
No, I have thought about that, actually.
Okay. And it's not a thought. It's some other thing. It's an enormous thing, right? And you're not really in command of it. It's a kind of realization that claims you. You don't claim it. So by the same token, you can see this thing called life. It's so much vaster than how I partake in it.
Yeah.
Okay, so then you're dying. You're really laying it down? Is that what it is?
No, I think, let me reiterate a little bit.
Of course, sure.
And please keep going with where we're going at me, because this is useful. Where it's like, you're going, or
Sometimes you do.
Right, and this is like I said, like you're in this ideal scenario.
Which you never are, but never mind. Go on.
Fair enough. No, fair enough.
Go on.
And it's just, I mean, personally, so you're going and you're lying there, and I can imagine it's like a radiant out of you, almost, where you are actually kind of fading away, and as you are fading away, and it's not that you're disappearing. Well, you are disappearing. I'm using quotes for people that are listening. Every time I say you are disappearing. However, yet a part of you isn't. A part of you is not. And that part of you that is not kind of takes over and dissolves the quote you as your body stops. And probably, so it's just a matter of knowing that this is happening and being with it the whole way and allowing it to play its way through. And giving that gift, I see it as like, I want to see it as a way of giving a gift to my family of like, this is how you can approach death. I see it as a way I can give them like, you don't need to be scared. You don't need to, all that stuff. You can allow it to do what it's going to do. It's a part of life. Like it's, I don't know. So I'm just elaborating a little bit more on where I was trying to go with that.
Mm-hmm, sure. No, I get the characterization.
Okay.
Of course I do. And of course I've thought of it, up, down, and sideways 1,000 times.
Mm.
So this would, ask your wife, were you married? Are you married?
We're engaged.
Okay. So ask her sometime, was there a part of her that wasn't in contractions? Was there a part of her that was giving into the contraction, if you will? Or, I'd be staggered.
Mm.
Maybe retroactively, there's a kind of would that it were so that turns into a memory. But in the moment, if you were to ask a contracting woman, so how's this working for that part of you that's not in contractions? See what I mean? Okay, it's a big deal, no?
Right.
And I don't think there's a part of you that ain't in it. Okay. I should say to you,
right.
I've nearly died myself a couple of times, but that's as close as I got.
Mm-hmm.
So we're guessing a little bit here now. Mm-hmm. But I could tell you this. Having sat with people who are dying, this is a fairly accurate rendering, what I'm going to say now. If I were to ask, not when do you begin to die, but where, probably your mind will go pretty quickly to wherever the cancer is, whatever the disease focus is. That's where you begin to die. If it's lung cancer, you're dying in your lungs first and so on. Well, that's where you decline, yes. Mm. But the residual consequences of not being able to breathe well don't stay in your lungs. Oxygenated blood becomes rare. Okay, there's a whole cascade of things. So you die in your cuticles at about the same rate that you're dying in your kidneys. Okay? And one of the things that's dying miraculously is your capacity to be absolutely terror-filled. That's dying at the same rate.
Mm-hmm.
All I can tell you, just extending that, is I'm not persuaded there's a part of you that's not dying. I think the dying is entire. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, what ensues thereafter would be another show.
Right.
Okay? And we would have a wonderful time guessing and going on a few little shreds of things we've seen, and basically it would be playing badminton with opinions. You know? Yeah. I guess there's some nominal use to it, but I'm not persuaded that when you die, that's it. Far from persuaded. But this doesn't mean that I work backwards from that and say, well, there's a part of us that's not dying, since there must be something after the fact.
Right.
I think you're dying completely in some fashion like this. When you got born, it's not there was a part of you that didn't get born. See what I mean? Mm-hmm. You got entirely born. I figure you're entirely died too. Mm-hmm. And that entirety is a soothing, reassuring proposition. Hmm? And it simply doesn't allow your mind to collapse into, so that's it then. I don't know, man. But I mean, this is observable, that you die pretty much entirely.
Yeah, I was going to kind of ask you, or I was thinking about this when I was coming into this interview with you, this conversation. was like, do you think there is like a natural, like the process of dying is very natural. If you're dying, whether it's quick or not, that like you're kind of saying here, it's affecting you on every level of your being. It's a holistic experience, psychologically, emotionally, and I wonder if there is this natural progression of letting that death do its thing. And like, so your thoughts, your emotions, things start to shift unless you start to try to control and interrupt things. And I can see that disrupting this natural harmony, like a birth, medicalized birth. You take a woman to the hospital and they start to slow down the birthing process. They're in this environment that's foreign and there's lots of people around. And don't get me wrong, there's some scenarios and unfortunately, well, our scenario, we had a C-section.
Right.
We had intended to do a home birth.
Right.
It just didn't work out that way. Yeah. We had the intention of doing a home birth.
Yeah.
Things happen. But so I could imagine that if you start to muddle and disrupt the dying process, that it could fragment parts of it perhaps, or, you know, and disconnect parts of it, where if it's happening kind of in its entirety, it probably plays out a very natural course, perhaps. What are your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, I would strongly caution you on employing the word so heavily, natural.
Okay.
Yeah. Largely because they're selling you toilet paper using that word now.
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
And investment strategies, you know, particularly on this coast.
Mm-hmm.
So natural simply doesn't have the, nothing happens when you say it. You picture a green field or what, you know, with cows or what.
Sure.
You know, or like, this is the way God planned it. Is that what you mean by now? Or, you know, no, look, I'm not sure it's a useful thought, the word natural. You could rather say perhaps something like this. Is there something called dying which is distinct from all other forms of dragging yourself around? Yeah. The dying is a particular zone that you find yourself in. Usually that's it. You don't walk into it. You find yourself there. You look up well into it, having arrived some time ago, and you say, is this where I am? As routinely, I was asked that. People would say to me, am I dying? Like that, with that sound in their voice. Mm-hmm. Not tell me I'm not, but genuinely perplexed.
Right.
How can I be dying? And I was just walking outside yesterday with the dog. They're not consistent, you know. Mm-hmm. Or I've had a good day. You can't have a good day and be dying, can you? Well, yeah, you can. But good day doesn't mean you're not dying. It means you're dying like that too, you see. So the involvement of the medical community in dying is neither here nor there for determining its deep propriety. Maybe I could call it that instead of naturalness. It's neither. It doesn't determine anything in and of itself. Their expertise should be employed wherever it's needed. The problem is in the word need. Because right now, you can't get anywhere near a dying person, but you don't go through the narrow archway of medicine. It's virtually impossible. The doctors own dying people, as a rule. I'm not saying they want to, but I'm saying their expertise predisposes them in this direction, okay? So if what you and I are talking about is going to change at the level of culture, the fundamental change will be our willingness to democratize the responsibilities that go with understanding what dying is and what it isn't, what it asks of us and what we impose upon it more or less arbitrarily. So it's a deeper responsibility for the wisdom of dying to be democratized. And it's the shirking of responsibility to allow it to continue to be specialized, I would say, okay? The specialized skill is in pain and symptom management. By all means, let's have it. I've been a beneficiary of that skill. I'm glad it's in the world. It's not unnatural. The question is, when dying is in the room anyway, does this determine what our job is? By job, I don't mean employment so much. I mean families, everyone.
Right.
Is this humming the tune? Is dying the one to be served? Or do we serve all of the disinclinations of dying people instead, and their families, and their caregivers, and the professions that surround them, and so on? Is that what it's for? Is dying just another occasion for doing what, quote unquote, we do best? That's generally what I saw. So you can hear me taking out a crowbar and prying dying away from what it has become, which is an opportunity to do something about it. But what about serving it? Serving dying? Yeah, because dying's asking things of us. It's asking us not to fire on all cylinders anymore. It's asking us to lay down with some grace the old expertises that we once had. It's asking us not to be a competence junkie anymore. It's asking us to think this thought. No matter how old you are when you're dying, there are probably people younger than you around who are watching you. And how you die will have consequence for them when it's their turn. Are you dying accordingly? Are you dying understanding that the meaning of this is not your death? It's not your death. You won't be there for the consequences of your death to unfold. So then, what are you doing with your dying? You are in turn trusting the memory of your death to others and its meaning. You see? This is not a matter of opinion. This is exactly what happens. If you die rancorous and contentious and fear-addled and screaming in the night, be not surprised that the next generation looks at euthanasia and says, I'll have two of those. I'll have two of those. Be not surprised. Because this virtually makes the case for euthanasia. Is all the bad deaths you saw before your own. That's what I mean about a political act and a subversive Trojan horse event and an act of love. And it's much more than that. But all of these things are there. This fundamentally wages war with the idea that you can do it the way it suits you. I know it does. That's why I'm sitting here talking to you and I don't have a job. Okay? Because when you call the mighty down in this regard, you're not attacking doctors or hospitals as being unnatural or worse. I'm certainly not. I am glad that they're there and would that they were allies in this. Okay? And maybe the day will come when more of them come over to this understanding. I don't know. I won't live to see it. But what I'm really saying is that death is a deity. It's not a malady. That death is a god. And it's of the old gods variety. Not the new gods on the block. Not the guys who think they're the only gods. Not those guys. The old gods, you know. And all gods in the old understanding were gods of particular places. They were all arising from that spring and that mountaintop and that valley and that so on. They didn't own it. They were that place. Well, that's what dying is as far as I can figure it out. Dying is an old god. And when it comes, it's not one of them Grim Reaper guys with a scythe meaning you harm. Okay? It has always been there. That's the amazing thing about dying is it's not in the future. You know, the moment of your death is not upon you now as a thing to be done. But it is upon you now as a thing to be known. And in that sense, it's deeply a companion. Right, you know, right there. It's not in the future. You're dying, you see. And that's its deifying power, is that it can deepen your days by not waiting until the end to appear to you. And people have said to me routinely in situations just like what we're doing now, in interviews, they'll say, so you've seen a lot of death, yeah. And you've probably seen your own, yeah. So you're good with it then. That's the conclusion. At which point I have to say, you know, if I keep the profanity out of my voice, I say, get behind me, Satan. I could say that. Or I could say, listen, I'm not going to pretend I don't know where your question's coming from. You think you see enough of it, you get numb or what? Or that you're so accepting you can't hardly stand it, right? That you don't even think about it. It's like opening the newspaper. I promise you, it's basically the reverse. Oh yeah, in the early going, when I used to see my death, in the asphyxiating death of people in front of me, don't you think there was a little panic in there and a little nighttime terror that ran through? You better believe there was. And I'm probably going to die, you know, with lung problems. And so I've seen it. I'm not looking forward to it. But with that came something else. I looked up from my work or from my writing, whatever it was, and routinely I began to realize I was alive. That's what it did to me. Okay? And I find life, being alive, to be habit forming. I dig it, is what I'm saying. Even the crazy shit, even the fatigue, even the you know what I'm saying, all of the stuff that's not working out.
Yeah.
If it's a package deal, and it seems to be, then one of the things that dying can do is hand you your life and say, will this do? Would you take this or me?
Right.
Because until it's me, it's this. Would you please engage this as the gift that it also is? This doesn't cancel. It's not Pollyanna time. Okay, it doesn't have sweetness and light. No, it's the whole thing. But all I'm telling you is, as somebody who was in the trenches, I'm sitting here on the other side of that experience, more or less thrilled, almost all the time, to be upright and to be able to draw breath without means mechanical, and to look around the room and be able to say, amen. This will more than do.
Right.
You know, and still I'm full of all kinds of complaint and contentiousness about this stuff, as the last hour has shown.
Right.
But it doesn't cool me out.
Right.
But what it does is make me a rather fierce practitioner of being alive.
I was going to just ask, is this a practice for you? You know, is it a constant kind of, and not in like a way of like, oh, I got to keep drudging along here. Just, it just becomes a reorientation of your relationship with life, the goods and the bads, the ups and the downs, you know, like, and describe, if you can, like you said, a practitioner, like describe that practice for you, I guess.
Well, I have a farm in Eastern Ontario, and that's one of the places when I'm not on the road, I get to proceed with these things in tow. They're not, we're talking about them as if they're things to think about.
Right.
That's like pretending the weather is what you think about, the weather. No, but there's real rain, especially out here, right, this time of year. And that shit's not a matter of opinion.
Right.
Well, what I'm talking about is not a matter of opinion. You know, how you feel about your new child is not a matter of, I'm sorry, I should have said it the other way around. Your child is not the sum total of how you feel about him or her. There's somebody there. Regardless of your feelings and your attachments and your all that thing, your fears and your hopes, and there's also somebody there. Well, that's what I'm talking about. So the practice is not eliminating or distancing yourself from how you feel about all this, all the ups and downs of your emotionality over it all. At least it's not for me. I'm not interested in being detached. And if that's the solution to suffering, I'll just take some suffering to go along with being here, you know. So if there's a practice, and it's a deliberate one, it's something in the order of being able to look at my time in the death trade and my time on the road on behalf of it since then as something like a strange celebration that nobody issued any invitations to, but it's mysteriously people appear in it. And we get to say something like I said earlier, amen once in a while, that we were lived long enough that we came to our senses fitfully. And then, like every other knucklehead in the world, don't you think I forget all this? I'm talking a good line right now.
Sure.
But if I get bunged up in traffic, which I'm going to in 10 minutes from now,
right,
what do you think I am? All sweetness and light and smiling at people out the window? No, I mean, these things are easy to forget, largely because you're engaged in a material world here in North America that proceeds as if this stuff is either junk or irrelevant or not there at all. So you don't have many people to tell. So mysteriously, it's like being at war. Once coming home, there's nobody to tell. And if you meet somebody who was in the war too, you don't tell them either because they know. It's something very close to that, you know. It's it can be lonely making. I don't misrepresent it as a great fellowship thing. It's very hard to pull that off because the deep distractedness of the Western life way leads you so far away from these understandings and towards all kinds of reward systems that encourage you to be mindless in this regard. Because you think about this stuff, it's just going to gut whatever profit motive you got. It just will. And properly so. And then you look up the window one morning and say, why am I going to do this one more time? And you won't be able to answer it. And if enough of that shit happens, that's what a revolution looks like. But unfortunately, our revolutions, our social and cultural revolutions in the West here take the form of defeat, not persuasion. That's what we wait for. And that's what's happening, certainly in the climate change thing. We're just, as a culture now, I know there are exceptions, we're waiting for the final iceberg to float by. Well, I guess it's not a matter of opinion anymore. I guess that's that. Oh, and there's the last polar bear on it.
Right.
Kind of thing. That's what I mean by defeat. Well, there's all manner of similar understandings of how we are vis-a-vis the limits of our own life. I mean, look, man, you don't have a chance at your age. When guys your age or a little bit older, the real money guys, the real IT money guys, where's their money going? Mars and eternity. That's where it's going. When this shit goes sideways, they're going to take the elect to Mars, right? And that's where your Musk money's going. That's his name, Musk?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, the other money's going to curing everything, so you won't be able to die of anything.
Right.
You lucky bastard. Well, that's going to be quite a life.
Yeah.
That you're going to have to dial it in when you're had enough.
Well, I've made this statement before on this show that I'm going to remain an orgy, as I call it.
What's that?
Well, just that notion of some people saying I'm going to become this bio hybrid and live on to 200 years. Personally, I'm just like, I'm going to remain organic and just live out my 80 years or whatever it is, and they'll call me an orgy and shame me and make fun of me, but I'll be out hopefully at my farm one day and actually they won't even be there anyway. So, but
right.
They
hopefully
won't be.
I won't be there at the farm that's no longer mine.
Yeah.
And that's how you tell the story.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the meaning of the entire thing is not up to me to dictate because I'm apparently elsewhere.
Yeah.
What have you. Look, it's not a victory march. I'm not writing a prescription here verbally for how to prevail. Okay. If you win at the death thing, you lose. See what I mean? If you turn your death thing into your death, and so on, you've so desperately lost. And you'll find that out. Or worse, maybe you won't. Right. And you just go kicking and screaming. Yeah. And you'll resemble that, do not go quietly into that good night, all of that thing. And if, on the other hand, you lose at dying, which is to say, you cannot prevail. You cannot exercise dominion over it. Then you win in life because your life is lived as if your dying is not a matter of opinion. And it informs how you go about it. Yeah, there's panic in there sometimes. And there's a real desperate sadness that it could be otherwise because you can picture it. Just living longer, whatever it is, you come up with plan B. And if you're willing to lay all your plan Bs down, to know that you're not in charge, but you have to keep up your end of the deal. Just like you did when you drew breath as an infant, okay? When it's time for you to render that breath for the last time, can you see it as the same deal you entered into? Not the extinction of the deal, the fulfillment of the deal. Yeah, it's sad. I'm sad talking about it. I got kids in their 30s, okay, my own children. I'm sad to say this stuff out loud. I'm not sitting there going, I got it figured out, it sure feels good. Hell no. But what it does feel is the repertoire for feeling expands. It doesn't narrow down to good or bad. It bifurcates, it gets subtle. And this is really you're firing on all cylinders as a human. When your repertoire for how you come to your dying includes wishing it wasn't so. That's not denial. That's called, you're alive. And you really wish it could continue. And you've thought about it. And you did you had a lot of vitamin C or whatever it is, or you floated in the tanks or whatever it is, Yeah. And would that it deepens your days without necessarily lengthening them. You see? Because that's where think of wine. So we're going to have to end up now because I myself got to go any minute.
Fair enough.
Think of wine. Like I myself am a fan. I don't understand wine, but I know I like it. And I like that wide-hipped red variety. That's my thing. I don't know why, but that's what I like. Now, how do we end up with that wide-hip variety, that deep-running red wine thing in the world? You start off with grape juice. But grape juice is not wine. So what do you need? Time. Of course you need time. And what happens if it's sitting in the right casks and everything is as it should be? One of the things that's happening is the wine is deepening in its flavor at the same time that it's doing what? Diminishing in its volume. You don't end up with the same amount when your wine deepens, right? You end up with less. That's what I'm talking about.
Beautiful. We'll end it there. Awesome. No, I just want to thank you. I think it was really, there's a lot more I wanted to get into, but whatever, we don't have time. But thank you. I think this is really important work. I think it's really meaningful and significant, and I love it. So I'm not even going to keep babbling on. It was awesome. Thank you so much for coming on, Stephen.
Thank you for the invitation.
Orphanwisdom.com.
Correct.
It's the website. Check it out, orphanwisdom.com. You can see links to the schoolwork that he does, the publications that you have, different teachings. It's a fascinating page. I haven't skimmed through all of it myself, but it's, and I knew this was going to be a very interesting conversation, and it was. So thank you very much.
Disappointed.
Awesome. Thank you not at all.
Me neither.
No, not at all. Thank you very much for coming on.
You're welcome.
And everyone for listening, thank you for joining us right to the end here. My best wishes to you, and just thank you for joining us. And to next time, to whatever is. I got to go back to my screen here.